Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The train leaves in a few minutes. All the seers off, please exit the car. You may wave to your loved ones from the platform. We hope you'll enjoy the trip. Drinks and snacks will be served soon. Get ready to travel through time. Our next stop is a medieval monastery in Modena. Imagine traveling on a train that is actually a time machine that would never bring you back. The 106 passengers and crew of the Zanetti train probably would have thought twice before they embarked on their adventure had they known that. Just like the passengers of the Titanic, which set off for its first and last cruise almost a year later, they never reached their destination. The difference, though, is that no one knows what happened to the train. On July 14, 1911, the rail company Zanetti offered well-off Italians a free trial ride on their new train. The passengers were enjoying their ride, watching scenic views along the way, making small talk, and enjoying their refreshments. One of the sights they were looking forward to was a new tunnel that went through a mountain. It was one of the longest ever built at the time. And that's where the mystery begins. The train entered the half-mile-long tunnel in Lombardy Mountain and never came out, just disappeared. After the incident, the railway workers and police searched every square foot of it, but found no trace of the train. The tunnel itself was just a long tube. There was nowhere to go but to the other side, yet there was neither a train nor any signs of a crash there. However, there were two passengers found who had jumped off the train just before it vanished into the tunnel. Later, when they came to, they were able to tell the story of their eerie trip. As the train approached the tunnel, black smoke came out of nowhere as well as a dense white fog. The train slowed down as it was nearing the entrance, and the fog began to envelop it. The men panicked and jumped to the ground before the train was gone. One of the survivors told an Italian newspaper about the incident. "I heard an unclear humming sound. Beyond the black smoke, I could see a milky white fog creeping from the tunnel. It literally swallowed the train like a wave. And with it, the first car of our ill-fated train split open. It became so horrifying. The train was barely moving, so I jumped from the car, and my eyes caught another passenger who jumped at the same time. We both hit the ground hard, and that is the last thing I remember." The injured men suffered from sleeping troubles and other stress disorders for a while. As for the train, it was never seen again. Word spread about the tunnel, and officials thought it was best to close it. Then, the notorious tunnel happened to get bombed during World War II, closing it off forever. No one could come up with a sound explanation for this strange disappearance. Dozens had witnessed the train leaving the station in Rome and entering the tunnel, but nobody saw it come out. But that's not the last time we'd hear about the mysterious train. There are records of medieval monks from Modena who saw a three-car train with people in it. How could they conceive a huge iron machine puffing clouds of black smoke? A horse was the fastest means of transport at the time. Railroads hadn't been invented yet. Well, they thought it, along with the passengers who they described were clean-shaven and dressed in black. All must be the work of some evil forces. You can say that medieval monks made it up. But here's the thing. Their report was kept in the records of Castasolia, stored by the Sagino family, and one of the survivors of the train had the name Sagino. Then, in the 1840s, there's a report that the Zanetti passengers were seen in Mexico. A psychiatrist in a local hospital left notes saying that a group of 104 Italians were all admitted in a hysterical state. They were all dressed in strange clothes, obviously from a different place, and claimed they were traveling from Rome by a Zanetti train. One of the passengers actually had a cigarette box with a future date of 1907 on it. They say it is still kept in a Mexican museum. The psychiatrist concluded that it was a case of mass insanity, but he failed to come up with any explanation for it. There are no records left of the patients after that. Many years later, the train appeared again in Europe. On October 29, 1955, A three-car, old-fashioned train appeared not far from Zavalichi, a small village in Ukraine. The signalman, Pyotr Ustimenko, saw it moving soundlessly. He reported that he had been on duty that night and suddenly saw a train that wasn't on the schedule. The train was heading without tracks to Gasford Mountain. He thought he was seeing things and rubbed his eyes, but there it was, with shut curtains, open doors, and an empty driver's cabin. Ustimenko had never seen a train like that before, but he knew it was old, definitely a pre-war model. The description he gave was the same as that of the Zanetti. It's unlikely a signalman from a remote town in the USSR would know anything about an Italian train lost at the beginning of the 20th century. Another interesting note about this sighting is that at the end of the 19th century, there was an Italian cemetery built on Gasford Mountain near Sevastopol. About 2,000 Italian soldiers who died during the Crimean War were buried there. Later, a railroad from Balaclava was constructed over the former cemetery, but then was destroyed after the Revolution of 1917 because it was no longer used. Was the ghost train riding on ghost tracks to meet its Italian brethren? I guess we'll never know. And again, this wasn't the last account of the train appearing. As crazy as all this sounds, could there be a scientific explanation of the ghost train adventures? Some believe all the railroads in the world form a sort of connected web that has its own magnetic field. The trains serve as electric conductors between the Earth's natural magnetic field and the artificial one. The conflict between the two forces creates fractures in time with endless holes. This explanation is based on Einstein's theory of relativity and Minkowski's definition of distance. These fractures are called chronal holes. Sometime before the Zanetti train left the station, there had been an earthquake where the tracks were. It's believed the crust fracture, which appeared under Lombardy Mountain, created a time anomaly at the entrance to the tunnel. The train became the link necessary to dig through time and space, and it fell from its time vector where it belonged and could move to other times. So, in layman's terms, it was traveling through time. In case you're already getting goosebumps and swearing off trains forever, rest assured that this isn't something you have to worry about happening to you, because it's just an urban legend. It got so popular that some paranormal enthusiasts devoted years to finding proof of the Zanetti train's existence. As time went on, more names and details were added to the legend. However, if you try to look up the rail company Zanetti, Castasolia, the Zangino family, or a signalman named Pyotr Ustimenko, you'll only find links to different versions of this legend. Ghosts and trains make for great stories, but there has yet to be any evidence of a ghost train ever existing. But I don't think that'll stop people from looking for them or telling more stories about them. If you have the time, you can find dozens of stories about ghost trains to keep you entertained. One of the most popular stories is a play written by Arnold Ripley in 1923, The Ghost Train, that was inspired by a creepy night he spent at a remote railway station. Sounds like a pretty good read. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 914. Please fasten your seatbelts and observe the no smoking sign. We will take off in 5 minutes. When we're at our cruising altitude, refreshments will be served to you. Our flight will take 37 years. I wish you a pleasant trip. What would you do if you went on a vacation to another city and suddenly found yourself in another country altogether? I guess more adventurous types would even enjoy such a change of plans, but most of us would be confused. Anyway, I bet even the most reckless of adventurers would at least raise an eyebrow if told they'd flown for close to half a century. On July 2, 1955, Pan American Flight 914 made its way from New York to Miami, Florida. It was a fine, sunny day, and 57 passengers on board the plane were looking forward to seeing the warm beaches and palm trees of Florida. The plane took off without trouble, but 3 hours later, when it should have already landed at the destination airport, it was nowhere to be seen. Radars of the control tower in Miami didn't show any approaching aircraft, and no distress signals were received either. When air traffic control contacted the New York Tower, they got a perplexing reply. Flight 914 just disappeared from the radars in mid-air. Everything indicated that the plane was lost. Apart from having vanished from the radars, air traffic control couldn't get through to the pilots with the radio. The DC-4 simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of itself or any of the people on board. Investigation was started right away. The flight route took the plane over a part of the Atlantic Ocean, and it seemed that the only explanation of its vanishing was that it crashed somewhere along the way. Rescue teams were deployed, the Coast Guard was scanning the waters, but still no luck. Not a single piece of the lost plane was to be found. Investigators could only shrug their shoulders in dismay. 61 people, passengers plus the crew, just blinked out of existence, along with a huge flying machine. Eventually, although the case was never really solved, there was an official statement that the plane crashed, taking the lives of everyone on board. But despite numerous and understandable questions from the grieving relatives, no one could say what really happened to Flight 914, until 37 years later at least. Change of scenery. It's now September 9, 1992, and we're in Caracas, Venezuela. It's a perfectly normal day for Juan de la Corte, air traffic controller at the Caracas airport. He turned up at work, made some coffee, and took his seat, overlooking flights. He was giving some minor comments on a flight in progress when something weird happened. Seemingly out of nowhere, a new dot appeared on the radar. It was as if an aircraft had just popped up from nothingness, or as if it had been hiding from the radar and now decided to show up. Either way, it was a strange thing to see near a civil airport, and de la Corte checked the reading several times, thinking at first that it was a mistake. It wasn't though. The readings were correct, and soon he and his colleagues were able to see it with their own eyes. In less than 10 minutes, the culprit showed up in the field of vision. At first, it looked to the air traffic control like an ordinary airplane. But as it got closer, they could see that it was, in fact, a very old DC-4 McDonnell Douglas passenger aircraft, still with propellers instead of modern turbines. Such planes were still in use, but they'd grown obsolete and mostly replaced by more contemporary ones. But that wasn't even the beginning of weird. The real confusion began when the pilot of the mysterious aircraft contacted the tower and asked in English, "Where are we?" As the one in charge at the time, Juan de la Corte replied they were closing in on the Caracas airport and asked where the flight was headed. There was a pause on the other side, and then the pilot answered, "We are Pan Am Flight 914 headed from New York to Miami, Florida, with a crew of 4 and 57 passengers on board." This took the air control completely off guard. What was a Pan Am flight doing 1,100 miles away from its point of destination? And how did it even get there? De la Corte was quick to ask a few more questions to the pilot, and what he heard next baffled him. The pilot said his flight was scheduled to land at the Miami airport at 9:55 a.m. on July 2, 1955. Now it was time for the tower to fall into silence. Before asking anything else, not to make matters worse, air control cleared the plane for landing. De la Corte didn't know what to make of the pilot's words. Perhaps he thought he went insane, but that was irrelevant since there were people on board the mystery airplane. He had to make sure they landed safely, and decided he would ask questions when they did. Ground units were immediately called to assist the plane and the passengers, and it landed without trouble. Having relaxed a little bit, Juan finally decided to ask something that bothered him. "Did you know today is May 21, 1992? Another pause that ensued told him it was a huge mistake to say that. As the ground crew approached the airplane, the pilot's bewildered voice on the radio said, "What are you talking about?" When de la Corte heard that, he knew he would have to order security guards to go to the plane and escort the passengers and the crew. However, as they were moving towards the aircraft, the pilot did something nobody expected. Juan heard the flight captain's panicking voice saying, "No, stay away! We're leaving now!" And indeed, he started the engines again and, without waiting for takeoff clearance, taxied the plane to the runway. Juan tried to stop him over the radio, telling him he was creating a dangerous situation, but the pilot didn't respond. He simply drove to the runway, accelerated, and took off. For some time, the plane could be seen in the air. Soon, it only appeared as a dot on the radar, and then it vanished again. No words could describe the shock Juan de la Corta and his colleagues at the air control tower were in. They had just seen an old airplane appearing out of nowhere, the pilot telling them he was headed to Miami, and before they could do anything, it flew away again, only to disappear in thin air like it had been a collective hallucination. No trace was found of that plane ever again, and to this day, no one can explain what happened that morning in Caracas. Smell that? Smells kinda fishy, right? I must say, though, there's much dispute about the credibility of this event. Back in 1985, a tabloid called Weekly World News was the first to cover this story. And yes, I just said 1985, 7 years before the most popular version appeared. Later, the same newspaper retold the story twice more, only with other details, and with 1992 set as the date of the time-traveling aircraft appearing in the future. The picture of Juan de la Corta, the air traffic controller in Caracas, also differed from the 1985 original, so the story was largely announced fake and it became sort of an urban legend. However, the legend still lives, and many sources retell it in their own way. Some even go as far as to say that the passengers of the plane eventually returned to their homes, and strangely, none of them looked a day older than 37 years prior, while everyone they knew grew old at a humanly pace. They say doctors examined the pilot, the crew, and the passengers, but couldn't find anything out of the ordinary. The people were healthy. Now this part doesn't look even remotely credible though, because no solid piece of evidence can be found about 61 people returning from a decades-long flight. I mean, come on, wouldn't they have run out of snacks? One thing that keeps popping up on the internet and piquing the interest of paranormal enthusiasts is a small pocket calendar that somehow was left on the Caracas airport runway when the notorious plane took off. The thing about it is that it's from 1955, and allegedly remains the only artifact of that weird encounter. There are still people who claim the calendar is real, but once again, there's no actual proof of its existence. Ah well, who knows? Maybe it's just a tall tale, an urban legend indeed. Or it could be a huge conspiracy to hide the fact that time travel is possible. I guess we'll never know. Wink wink. And what do you think? Was Flight 914 really lost in time for 37 years, or is it all just a hoax? You. Yeah, you. You ever dreamt of traveling through time? Would you go to the future or to the past? Rudolph Fentz didn't choose the time, he simply found himself in Times Square, hardly recognizing anything. People in unusual clothes, strange noisy machines he'd never seen before, lights everywhere. What happened? It was in the summer of 1951. At about 11:15, passers-by in Times Square noticed a young man in his 20s. He was dressed in the fashion of the late 19th century. He looked lost and clueless, and obviously had no idea how he'd gotten to the crossroad. Where did he come from? Nobody saw it. He just appeared in that spot, as if out of thin air. When he finally started walking, he was struck by a car. He was badly injured and didn't survive. Later, his clothes were searched and the following things were found in his pockets. A copper token for beverages worth 5 cents. It had the name of a restaurant which the locals didn't recognize. A bill for the care of a horse and a carriage wash. It was issued by a horse stable on Lexington Avenue. There was no horse stable there at that time. Old banknotes were $70. Business cards with the name Rudolph Fentz and an address on Fifth Avenue. A letter sent to this man at the same address from the business cards in June 1876 in Philadelphia. All these things looked brand new, not like they'd been around for 75 years. The case was given to Captain Hubert V. Rim of the Missing Persons Department of NYPD. He found the address on the business card, but there was a commercial firm there whose owners had never heard of Rudolph Fentz. Fence's name also wasn't mentioned in the address book, his fingerprints weren't found in any records, and nobody had reported a missing person to the police with this name or having a similar description. Could the man have false documents with him? Was it just a prank that ended badly? Rimm continued his investigation and finally found Rudolph Fentz Jr. in a telephone book from 1939. Rimm questioned the residents who lived at the listed address and managed to learn that Rudolph Fentz did live here once and worked nearby. Having retired in 1940, he'd moved away. The policeman found the widow of Rudolph Fentz Jr. in Florida. She'd lost him 5 years earlier. She said that her father-in-law, Rudolph Fentz Sr., went missing in 1876 at the age of 29 years. He just went out for an evening stroll, and nobody ever saw him again. Searches gave no results. Rimm looked through the widow's albums and found Fentz's picture there. You guessed it, the man in the picture looked identical to the stranger from Times Square. The whole story looked weird, and Captain Rimm failed to find any explanation for it that would make sense. He decided not to mention these details in the official reports, and Rudolph Fentz's case was never solved. Interest for this story grew again after 1972, when it was mentioned in books and articles related to this subject as proof of traveling through time. In 2000, a Spanish magazine, Masala, published a 6-page article devoted to the incident. The author of the article was Carlos Canales. By that time, he'd written 2 books studying paranormal events and folklore. Another researcher of folklore, Chris Aubeck, was really interested in the article and conducted his own investigation. He studied the magazines of that time and found similar stories passing from one country to another, from Sweden to Norway, Italy, Spain, and France. But he also noticed that there was never any proof or solid facts mentioned, and the details were different, sometimes even contradictory in different countries. Later, he came to the conclusion that the legend started from the article about Fentz in a June issue of Journal of Borderland Research in 1972, which depicted the story as a true one. The journal had a questionable reputation, and its target audience was mostly UFO and paranormal event fans. It, in its turn, referred to Ralph Holland's book, A Voice from the Gallery from 1952. Aubeck believed that this actually gave birth to the urban legend. After Aubeck publicized the results of his investigation in the Akron Beacon Journal, he was addressed by science fiction fan George Murphy. He explained that the original source of the legend was actually even older. As a result, they found out that the legend was inspired by a short story written by Jack Finney in 1950 and first published under the title I'm Scared in 1951. In 1952, it was included in the anthology of science fiction writing Tomorrow the Stars. The plot of the short story is identical to what became the urban legend later. The narrator of this story is Captain Hubert Rimm. Since that time, the story of Rudolph Fentz became one of the most popular urban legends of the 70s and was repeated many times later. The spread of the internet in the 90s gave another life to it. It started being mentioned again as fact and proof of the existence of time travelers. It's a great example of how urban legends come into being. People love unusual stories and are eager to believe in them. It's always been like that. But the progress of technology made it much easier for rumors and unproved facts to circulate on the internet among thousands of people.